I stood in front of the mirror, twisting the delicate necklace my grandmother had given me. The diamonds caught the chandelier's light, sparkling like tiny stars, and I couldn't help but feel a little out of place. Dressed in a gown that was elegant but not flashy, I looked every bit the part of a woman attending a grand gala, but I didn't feel it. Confidence was complicated tonight, tangled up in anticipation, nerves, and that familiar weight of knowing I was just the wife to someone who cared more about appearances than me. Before we continue, please comment where you are watching from and don't forget to subscribe for more interesting stories. From the living room, I heard Thomas pacing. His footsteps were heavy and loud, and I already knew what was coming. He always paced before he gave instructions. Tonight, I braced myself. "Elena, come here," he called, his voice carrying both excitement and that same commanding authority he always had. "Look at this invitation. The gala is at the Sterling Hotel. Harrison Blake is flying in the new CEO. This is our chance to make a real impression. You have to be perfect tonight." I exhaled slowly, placing my hand on the mirror. "Thomas, you said I could just—" "You can stay in the back," he interrupted quickly. "Let me handle the talking. You don't have to worry. Just don't do anything to distract from the plan. Everything must be perfect." I nodded, forcing a polite smile. He meant well, I think, but he had no idea that the things that mattered to me rarely matched what mattered to him. I had my own work, my own thoughts, and tonight, I just wanted to survive the evening without losing myself in his plans. The drive to the hotel was tense. Thomas rattled off names, titles, and details about other guests as if reciting a battle strategy. I listened, nodding occasionally, but my mind wandered. Harrison Blake. I'd read about him. He was a man who could command a room with a glance, who seemed to recognize talent immediately. The thought of him intrigued me not for the status or advantage, but for the sheer curiosity of seeing someone so perceptive in action. The Sterling Hotel glittered under the city lights, grand and imposing. A red carpet led to the entrance, and elegantly dressed guests mingled in the warm glow of the chandeliers. I followed Thomas inside, noting the faint scent of roses and polished marble. Laughter and the clinking of glasses filled the air. Everything screamed wealth, influence, and sophistication. Thomas immediately started moving through the crowd, shaking hands, introducing himself to familiar faces. "This is my wife, Elena," he said proudly. "She's brilliant, of course, but prefers to stay in the background tonight." I smiled politely, exchanging greetings, while sensing subtle curiosity in the way people glanced at me. Polite compliments. Yes, but there was something else in those eyes, something I didn't expect. As Thomas moved on, I found myself near the grand staircase, observing quietly. The chandelier cast a soft glow across the marble floors, reflecting off glittering gowns and polished shoes. Couples laughed, whispered, and moved carefully, each aware of social hierarchies that I had long since learned to notice. I watched and listened, curious about the rhythms of a room full of ambition and power. Time passed slowly, my attention drawn to the small details. A handshake that lasted too long, a subtle glance meant to intimidate, a whisper in the corner that made someone stiffen. I felt a mixture of excitement and impatience, knowing something significant was coming, though I didn't yet know what. Thomas returned, looking unusually tense. "I don't know where he is," he muttered. "Everyone says he's here, but I haven't seen him yet. Stay close to me, okay? No wandering off. This is important." I nodded, but inwardly I smiled. I wasn't planning to confront anyone or seek attention. I just wanted to see the world through my own eyes tonight, to notice things that Thomas never did. And I had a feeling I would. Then I felt it, the shift in the air. The room seemed to quiet just a little. Guests straightened in their posture, conversations slowed, and whispers traveled faster. A presence was approaching, something that made people sit up, hold themselves differently. I couldn't see him yet, but I knew. I knew that whatever was coming would change the tone of the evening entirely. I adjusted my necklace one last time, took a deep breath, and waited. Somewhere across the room, the man everyone had been talking about was about to arrive. And though I didn't yet understand the role I would play in the night, I knew I was ready to watch it unfold. Tonight, I realized, would not be ordinary. The murmur of the crowd shifted, like a tide pulling inward. I could feel the change before I even saw him. Every conversation slowed. Every laugh softened. I glanced around, and I wasn't imagining it. People's heads turned almost instinctively toward the grand entrance. The anticipation was palpable. My pulse quickened, a mixture of curiosity and something I couldn't name. Thomas, of course, was oblivious. He kept adjusting his cufflinks, muttering under his breath about who he should greet first. Elena, remember to smile. Don't just stand there. People notice everything. I gave him a tight smile, nodding, though my eyes remained focused on the doorway. And then he appeared. Harrison Blake. I remember the first thing I noticed wasn't his face, his height, or the confidence in his stride. It was the way he moved, as if the entire room adjusted to him without a word being spoken. His presence didn't demand attention. It drew it effortlessly. He wasn't loud, he wasn't flashy, yet every person in the room subtly shifted, some straightening their posture, others leaning in to listen to those around them. I had read about men like this in business magazines, but seeing it in person was different. It was like watching a stone ripple through water, affecting everything in its path without touching it. Thomas straightened immediately. "That's him," he whispered, barely audible over the soft music and conversation. "That's Harrison Blake." I didn't answer. My eyes tracked him as he shook hands with a few prominent guests. I could see the respect in their expressions, the way some people almost instinctively deferred to him. And then, something unexpected happened. My gaze met his. It was subtle at first, a brief glance across the room, but I felt it. He didn't just see me, not in the casual, passing way strangers notice one another. He saw me, like he could look straight through the layers, right past the dress, the polished hair, the polite smile, and somehow see everything underneath. Thomas didn't notice, of course. He was too busy charming someone from the board, laughing a little too loudly, trying a joke he thought would land. He moved closer to me, his hand brushing mine as if to anchor me in my place. I pulled back subtly, not out of rudeness, but instinct. Something in the air had shifted, and I felt like a part of the room was waiting for me to notice it too. Blake's steps finally brought him closer to our corner. He moved with the kind of calm confidence that made everyone around him pause, even if just for a fraction of a second. And then he stopped. Not at Thomas. Not at the people shaking hands around us. He stopped in front of me. For a moment, I couldn't speak. I barely breathed. It was as if time itself had slowed. I wanted to say something polite, something that wouldn't draw attention, but my words caught in my throat. He didn't smile widely or exaggerate in any way. He just looked at me, and the look itself was enough to make me feel both exposed and seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. "Hello," he said softly, with a voice that was calm but unmistakably confident. "You must be Elena." I blinked, taken aback. "Yes," I managed to say. My voice sounded strange, too quiet, even to my own ears. He nodded slightly, as if confirming something to himself. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you." The way he said it, it wasn't flattery. It wasn't small talk. There was a recognition in his tone, like he had been looking for me long before tonight, though I had never met him before. I didn't know what to say. Thomas finally noticed. He turned, grinning, and offered a handshake. "Harrison! Pleasure!" Blake's attention barely flickered to Thomas. His eyes returned to me almost immediately. I could feel Thomas stiffen beside me, a subtle tension that I recognized all too well. Thomas had always been possessive, though he rarely admitted it. Seeing the man he wanted to impress focus on me instead, it clearly threw him off. I tried not to notice the moment, to focus on something else, anything else, but I couldn't. Blake asked a few quiet questions, nothing overt, nothing intrusive. "How long have you been with the company?" he asked, his tone conversational, gentle. I answered carefully, describing my role in marketing, the projects I handled, and a few of the challenges I had faced. I felt exposed, in a way, but also curious. Every word I spoke seemed to matter to him, not just as information, but as a reflection of who I was. And I realized something. No one had looked at me like this in years. Not Thomas, not my colleagues, not even my friends. Thomas kept trying to interject, dropping names, talking about deals, about connections. Blake listened politely, but his attention never wavered from me. I saw the confusion cross Thomas's face, the flush of embarrassment, and I couldn't help but feel a quiet satisfaction. Not because I wanted to embarrass him, but because I finally understood what it felt like to be seen for what I was, not for what someone else claimed I was. I asked Blake a question in return, something small about his work philosophy. I wanted to understand why people admired him, why his presence had such an effect on everyone in the room. He answered thoughtfully, with insight, without arrogance, but also without deflection. He spoke as if he had considered every detail of what he said, and yet it felt natural, like he had no need to impress anyone. The crowd around us continued to mingle, but I felt a quiet bubble form around our corner. Even Thomas seemed to sense it, though he tried to ignore it, speaking louder, gesturing more aggressively as if volume could reclaim attention. Blake didn't flinch. He didn't react. He simply listened, smiled faintly when appropriate, and looked at me as if he genuinely wanted to know more. Somewhere in the room, I heard laughter, clinking glasses, a soft melody of conversation, but it all felt distant. My focus was entirely on this man who had entered the room and quietly shifted its gravity. I felt a mix of emotions, curiosity, excitement, confusion, and a strange sense of vulnerability. It was unsettling, but not in a bad way. It was the kind of unsettling that made you realize how much of yourself you had hidden, how much you had allowed others to define your worth. And now, in a subtle but undeniable way, it felt like that had changed. I caught myself smiling slightly. Blake noticed, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. He asked about my work in more detail, about the challenges I faced, and about how I managed to accomplish what I did despite the odds. The questions were simple, but the way he asked them attentively genuinely made me feel like I was finally being understood. Thomas, at this point, had begun to fidget. He attempted to steer the conversation back to business strategies, investments, and the gala itself. I answered politely but subtly redirected my attention to Blake. I could see his curiosity, his perceptive gaze taking in more than just my words. He was reading between the lines, noticing what I didn't even say aloud. The evening went on. The music continued. The guests laughed and mingled, but I remained acutely aware of this moment. Not because I wanted it, not because I sought attention, but because it reminded me of something I had long forgotten. The quiet satisfaction of being recognized for who you are, not who someone else wants you to be. I didn't know where this would lead. I didn't even know what it meant yet. All I knew was that something had shifted tonight, subtly, undeniably. And as I watched Blake engage with the crowd, I realized he wasn't just a CEO, not just a man with influence. He was someone who noticed, who valued perception beyond appearances. And for the first time in a long time, I felt noticed. Thomas glanced at me once, a mix of pride and frustration on his face. He had no idea what had just happened. I, however, felt it deeply. The room had changed for me, even if it hadn't for anyone else. And somewhere, in the midst of glittering gowns and polished shoes, I felt a spark of something new, something quiet but insistent, like the first hint of sunlight after a long, gray morning. I adjusted my necklace, took a breath, and decided to stay fully present for the rest of the evening. Something told me that tonight would not be ordinary, and for the first time in years, I felt ready to notice it, without fear, without distraction, and without pretense. After what felt like hours of polite conversation, handshakes, and forced smiles, I finally found a quiet corner near the ballroom's far side. Thomas had wandered off to schmooze with another group of executives, completely unaware that the energy in the room had shifted without his notice. For the first time since arriving, I could breathe. I was adjusting the folds of my dress when I felt a presence beside me. I didn't need to look up to know it was him. Harrison Blake. "You've been watching," he said quietly, as if reading my thoughts. His voice had that same calm authority, but now it carried a hint of amusement. I blinked, startled. I suppose I have," I admitted. My cheeks warmed slightly. It's fascinating, watching how people interact. The room changes depending on who's here, who's speaking. It's subtle, but noticeable. He smiled faintly, not condescending, not teasing, just aware. That's an uncommon observation. Most people are too focused on themselves to notice how others move around them. It's refreshing to see someone paying attention without pretending to be part of the performance. I felt a strange flutter in my chest. Nobody had ever said something like that to me before. Not Thomas, not my colleagues, not anyone. They saw me, yes, but rarely this deeply. It was almost unnerving, yet oddly comforting. I shrugged, unsure how to respond. I guess I've spent enough time observing people to notice patterns. Patterns, he repeated thoughtfully. It's a rare skill. Most people never see them, or they see them but ignore them. But you notice, and you interpret. He paused, watching me. That's important. In business, in life, in understanding people, it's rare to find someone who actually sees the world as it is, not how they want it to be. I swallowed hard, feeling a mix of admiration and confusion. I didn't know whether to be flattered or cautious. Compliments like these weren't usually given, they were earned, and rarely so openly. But something about his presence made it feel honest. I wanted to say something clever, something that would acknowledge the compliment without seeming too eager, but I didn't. I simply nodded. "I try to be honest," I said softly. He tilted his head, as if weighing my words. "Honesty is underrated. Most people hide behind politeness, masks, or distractions. I respect those who don't." The conversation was unexpectedly personal, yet it didn't feel intrusive. I felt drawn to him, as if we were the only two people in the room, even with Thomas not 10 feet away, oblivious to the quiet dynamic forming. I glanced toward Thomas. He was laughing at something someone said, gesturing broadly, completely unaware of the subtle moment unfolding beside him. Part of me felt guilty. I had promised myself I wouldn't let the evening become about anything other than observation. But the more I spoke with Blake, the more I realized how starved I had been for someone to genuinely notice me. He continued, shifting the conversation subtly. "Tell me about your work. What challenges have you faced that most people wouldn't understand?" I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. But something in his gaze encouraged me to speak honestly. "It's often overlooked," I said. "How much effort goes into shaping public perception? Marketing isn't just about selling a product, it's about understanding people, anticipating reactions, and influencing decisions without anyone realizing it. But it's exhausting sometimes. You're expected to be perfect, seamless, unnoticed if necessary, while making sure everything else looks effortless." He nodded slowly, as if each word resonated with him. "I understand that. It's a skill often underappreciated until it fails, and then everyone points fingers. But when someone executes it well, the impact is immense. You seem to understand that balance." I felt warmth in my chest, a mix of pride and surprise. He wasn't just hearing me, he was truly listening. And in a room full of polished smiles and half-hearted compliments, that was rare. There was a pause, a comfortable silence that didn't feel awkward. I realized I was aware of every detail around us, the subtle shift of lights from the chandelier, the soft hum of conversation, the delicate clinking of glasses, but none of it mattered. What mattered was the quiet connection, the rare sensation of being understood without pretense. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, not fully aware that I was speaking aloud. "Because it matters," he said simply. "Most people are too busy trying to impress others to recognize who they're standing in front of. You notice. You understand." I felt a strange mix of pride and fear. Pride because someone could recognize me in such a way. Fear because this attention felt so unusual, so sudden. My life with Thomas had been comfortable, predictable, and often lonely in small ways I had learned to ignore. This was different. "Do you always speak to strangers like this at galas?" I asked, attempting humor, though it came out uneven. He smiled faintly. "No. I speak to the people worth noticing. I don't waste energy on the performance unless necessary." His words struck me. Worth noticing. It sounded so simple, yet it carried such weight. It made me think of how often I had faded into the background, how often I had allowed others to define my worth without question. For the first time in years, I felt acknowledged. A waiter passed by, offering champagne, and I realized I hadn't even registered Thomas's presence beside me for the past few minutes. I glanced at him discreetly. He was still engrossed in conversation, still unaware that the focus of the room and, more importantly, of my attention, was elsewhere. I turned back to Blake, sensing a subtle shift in his demeanor. His questions became slightly more personal, probing without being intrusive. "What do you want, Elena?" he asked softly. "Not what you've been told to want. Not what people expect of you. What do you want?" The question stopped me cold. It wasn't rhetorical. It wasn't flattery. It was genuine. I wasn't used to being asked such a thing, not seriously, not directly. I hesitated. Could I answer honestly? Could I even know? I want to be seen," I admitted quietly. "Not as someone's wife, or someone's assistant, or someone's employee, just seen for who I am, the real me." He nodded slowly, as if he had expected this answer, or perhaps as if he had been waiting for it. "Then you've already begun to be noticed tonight. Not by everyone, but by those who matter." His words lingered in my mind. I realized the weight of what he was saying. He wasn't flattering me. He wasn't offering empty praise. He was simply acknowledging something I had longed to hear, longed to feel, but rarely experienced. I felt a rush of emotion, complex and unexpected. There was curiosity, pride, and a strange sense of liberation. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel invisible. I felt present, seen, recognized. Thomas, of course, remained completely oblivious. He continued talking, laughing, gesturing, performing the role he had rehearsed for hours. And yet, in the quiet corner where Blake and I stood, the world had shifted in subtle ways that mattered more than any gala, any handshake, any social performance. I realized, as I listened to him speak, that tonight was not about appearances, power, or influence. It was about something else entirely, something rare, something I had nearly forgotten existed in my life, a genuine connection, a moment where someone truly saw me. And in that moment, I felt something stir within me, a spark of possibility, a quiet awareness that life could be different, that I could be different, that I could matter in ways I hadn't allowed myself to notice before. I adjusted my necklace, took a deep breath, and decided to stay fully present for the rest of the evening. Something told me that tonight would not be ordinary, and for the first time in years, I felt ready to notice it, without fear, without distraction, and without pretense. I stayed near the quiet corner of the ballroom, feeling the soft hum of the gala fade around me. Thomas had moved on to another group of executives, completely absorbed in his performance. and I was grateful for the small space to think. I hadn't realized just how tense I'd been, shoulders tight, jaw clenched, until I felt a hand lightly touch mine. Harrison Blake. "You're still here," he said. Almost a statement, almost an observation. His voice was calm, steady, yet it carried that magnetic weight I couldn't shake. I was beginning to wonder if I'd been imagining our conversation earlier. I blinked, startled. I couldn't leave, I admitted. It's interesting, speaking with someone who actually listens. He smiled faintly, just enough to suggest understanding. Listening is rare. Most people only hear what they want to hear. But you listen and observe, and you think. I felt a strange warmth in my chest, the kind I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. Not since the beginning of my marriage, perhaps. Thomas had never looked at me like this. Not really. He had always admired things on the surface, my appearance, my manners, the way I fit into his world, but never the person I was underneath. "You notice things others miss," he continued, his tone gentle but probing. "You understand dynamics, read situations, and you don't manipulate them. That's rare." I swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. I wanted to say something clever, something that would deflect, but I couldn't. I simply nodded. "I try to be aware. I suppose I've always watched more than I speak. And that awareness," he said, leaning slightly closer, "it's powerful. You understand people. You see beyond what they show, and you process it with clarity. That is valuable." It wasn't flattery. It wasn't praise for a job well done or a dress well chosen. It was recognition of me, the person I was when no one else was watching. And it left me feeling vulnerable, exposed in the best possible way. I looked down for a moment, adjusting the folds of my dress. "I don't know that anyone's ever said that to me before," I admitted softly. He studied me with that quiet intensity. "Most people don't recognize what they overlook. But it's not about them. It's about you seeing yourself clearly." I felt my chest tighten. A swirl of emotions I couldn't name. Pride, surprise, curiosity. And somewhere beneath it all, a quiet spark of hope I hadn't felt in years. Then, inevitably, Thomas returned. He walked toward me with that familiar, confident smile, extending his hand to Blake. "Harrison, great to see you again. Elena, you must meet." Blake's attention barely shifted. His eyes, calm and unwavering, remained on me. I noticed the faint flush of Thomas's face, the way his jaw tightened ever so slightly. He glanced at me, perhaps realizing, for the first time tonight, that something in the room had shifted in a way he hadn't anticipated. Thomas tried to reclaim the moment, speaking louder, gesturing, dropping names, but Blake remained calm. He nodded politely, acknowledged Thomas, but then turned back to me as if Thomas were part of the background now. I felt a subtle thrill, not of triumph over Thomas, but of recognition. For the first time in years, someone was noticing me, and not for my relation to someone else or my role in an organization, but for who I actually was. Blake's gaze was thoughtful. "You have a presence," he said quietly. "That's easy to overlook until you take the time to notice it. But it's there. Always." I felt my throat tighten. I never considered myself remarkable," I admitted, almost in a whisper. He shook his head slightly. "Remarkable isn't always loud or obvious. It's often quiet, consistent, patient. And you have that quality. It doesn't go unnoticed." I caught my reflection in the polished marble nearby, realizing how much of myself I'd buried under routine, under expectation, under Thomas's constant need to control appearances. And yet, here I was, feeling alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. Thomas, still standing a few feet away, frowned subtly. He was beginning to understand, perhaps too late, that my attention and presence were no longer entirely his domain. But I didn't notice him. I couldn't. I was too focused on the conversation, the rare recognition of being truly seen. Blake continued, his voice low and measured. Tell me about the work you're most proud of. Not what everyone knows, not what they see on paper, but the moments where you felt you truly made a difference. I hesitated. Most people asked about titles, achievements, or results. He asked about impact, about meaning. I took a breath. There was a campaign I led last year, I began, that nobody noticed beyond its immediate success, but it changed the way our team worked together. It taught me how to inspire people without pushing them, how to recognize potential quietly, and how to trust my instincts. It wasn't glamorous, but it mattered. To me, at least. He listened attentively, nodding as if each word carried weight. That's exactly the kind of understanding most people lack. You focus on substance, on integrity, on results that have meaning beyond appearance. That's rare. I felt a flush of warmth and disbelief. How could one person see what I had spent years hiding, what I had struggled to believe mattered at all? Thomas, sensing he was losing my attention, spoke again, louder this time, trying to interject with a story about a deal he had closed earlier in the day. Blake listened politely, but did not interrupt me. I felt a quiet surge of empowerment. For the first time, I realized I didn't need Thomas to define my value in the room or anywhere else. I adjusted my necklace, feeling a new confidence settle over me. My chest was lighter, my mind sharper, and my awareness of the room was no longer about fitting in. It was about being present, being seen, and understanding my own worth. Blake smiled faintly, as if noticing the shift within me. It's good to see someone recognize their own value, he said quietly. Too often, people wait for others to validate them. But that validation is only meaningful when it comes from yourself. I nodded, feeling the truth in his words. It was a realization I had buried under expectations, under routines, under years of feeling like I needed permission to matter. But tonight, in this quiet corner of a glittering gala, I was beginning to see it for myself. Thomas, still trying to regain control of the evening, looked frustrated, but I barely noticed him. My attention was on something entirely different, a small, quiet awareness that I was capable of more than I had allowed myself to believe, that I could be seen, recognized, and understood without needing anyone else to define me. And in that moment, I felt a subtle but profound shift. The gala, the glittering gowns, the polished shoes, even Thomas's frantic networking, all of it faded slightly. What remained was clarity, focus, and a new understanding of myself. I took a deep breath, feeling a sense of calm determination I hadn't known I possessed. For the first time in years, I realized I could navigate this world on my own terms, while still appreciating moments of genuine connection. And as I looked at Harrison Blake, I felt a quiet certainty that tonight would leave a mark on my awareness, my confidence, and perhaps on the way I chose to live my life from now on. I adjusted my necklace one last time, squared my shoulders, and allowed myself to be fully present. Tonight wasn't about appearances, or status, or anyone else's expectations. Tonight was about being seen, and for the first time in a long time, I knew I truly was. The gala had reached its peak. Music floated softly in the background, but the room felt quieter to me now, almost intimate despite the crowd. Thomas had moved on again, talking to investors and executives, trying to reclaim his sense of control, but I barely noticed him. My attention was elsewhere, focused, aware, alive. Harrison Blake appeared beside me again. Not intrusive, but steady. "Elena," he said softly, "I hope I'm not keeping you from enjoying the evening." I'm enjoying it," I replied honestly. "More than I expected to. I didn't anticipate this kind of conversation tonight, or this kind of clarity." He studied me, his gaze calm but intense. Clarity is hard to come by. Most people never see themselves as they truly are. You, however, see more than just appearances. You see depth. I smiled faintly, a mixture of humility and quiet pride. It's taken me a long time to see it myself. I, I've spent years fading into expectations, others' expectations. Tonight feels different. I feel like I'm noticing myself again. He nodded, as if acknowledging something unspoken. That's important. Not just to be noticed, but to recognize your own value. You've allowed yourself to exist quietly in the background for too long. It's time to reclaim space that's rightfully yours. His words struck a chord I hadn't realized I was ready to hear. The years of invisibility, of quietly managing everything while making sure no one noticed the effort, had built walls around me. But tonight, those walls felt thinner, like I could step through them without fear. I glanced toward Thomas, who was laughing too loudly at some story, the flush of competitiveness on his face visible even from a distance. Part of me wanted to feel frustration at his oblivion, but instead, I felt liberation. He no longer defined the room for me. I was here, fully present, fully myself, and no one could take that away. Blake leaned slightly closer, his tone quiet but firm. You have a rare combination of awareness and strength, Elena. Most people wouldn't recognize it, but I do. I felt my heartbeat quicken, a subtle thrill running through me. It wasn't attraction, not in the shallow sense. It was recognition, a deep acknowledgement that my worth didn't require validation from anyone else. And yet, having someone else see it, it mattered in a way I hadn't expected. Thomas finally approached us again, this time more cautious. He had noticed the subtle shift in my attention, the way Blake's calm presence seemed to eclipse him. He opened his mouth, but I didn't give him the chance to speak. I felt no obligation tonight to perform for anyone but myself. Thomas, I said, softly but clearly, I think I'll step away for a moment. I need some air. He hesitated, the confusion evident. Are you sure? Yes, I replied with a quiet certainty I hadn't felt in years. I need to think, to reflect. I moved toward the balcony overlooking the city, Blake following silently behind, respectful of my space. The cool night air greeted me, and I drew a slow breath, letting the wind carry away the weight of expectations I had carried for so long. I didn't realize how much I needed this, I admitted after a moment, speaking to no one in particular. Blake remained beside me, silently listening, giving me the freedom to speak without pressure. You've carried a lot quietly, he said. It's no small feat to navigate the expectations placed on you and still maintain awareness, dignity, and integrity. That takes strength. I nodded slowly, letting his words sink in. It feels empowering, finally realizing I can notice myself, my own worth, without relying on anyone else to define it. For so long, I thought that if others didn't acknowledge me, it meant I didn't matter. I see now, that's not true. He smiled faintly. It's not. And tonight, you've shown yourself that it isn't. That's the first step to living fully in your own power. The city lights stretched endlessly below, and I felt a quiet sense of peace settle over me. I thought about the years of silent compromise, of blending into the background while supporting others' ambitions. That life hadn't been wasted. It had given me patience, perspective, and resilience. But tonight, I understood that my story didn't have to end in invisibility. Blake's presence was steady, unwavering, but he didn't dominate the moment. He simply allowed me to experience it fully, to reflect on myself, and to recognize that being seen wasn't a threat, it was a gift. I glanced back toward the gala hall. Thomas had resumed his performance, smiling and laughing, unaware that the moment had passed him by. I felt no anger, no resentment, just clarity. I understood my own priorities now, my own boundaries, and my ability to define my own space in a world full of expectations. Turning back to Blake, I felt a quiet gratitude not just for him noticing me, but for giving me the space to notice myself. Thank you, I said softly. For seeing me. He nodded, his eyes calm but warm. You were always meant to be seen. You just had to recognize it yourself. I took a deep breath, feeling the cool night air fill my lungs, carrying with it a sense of renewal. I was no longer invisible, no longer defined by others' expectations. I was present, fully, undeniably, myself. And in that quiet understanding, I realized something profound. Tonight wasn't about impressing anyone, not even Blake. It was about reclaiming myself, acknowledging my own worth, and stepping into a life where my presence mattered simply because I existed. The gala continued behind us, a blur of music, laughter, and performance, but it no longer held power over me. I had found clarity, recognition, and quiet strength in an unexpected place, and that was enough. I adjusted my necklace one last time, feeling its weight grounding me, and smiled. For the first time in years, I felt free, seen, alive. And that, I realized, was the greatest victory of all. As the gala lights faded behind me, I realized my worth has never depended on anyone else. For years, I had faded into expectations that weren't mine. Tonight, I was seen not for my role, my appearance, or anyone's plans, but for who I truly am. I felt alive, present, and free, ready to define my life on my own terms. Thank you so much for watching. If Elena's story inspired or moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping emotional stories. Hit the bell to never miss an upload.